The night over Long Island was cold and heavy, like a damp fog had settled over everything and refused to leave. The air carried the salty breath of the Atlantic Ocean, and waves rolled against the shoreline with a dull rhythm, as if warning of something hidden beneath their surface. Ocean Parkway, the narrow road that winds through Gilgo Beach, stretched ahead almost completely empty. From a distance, it looked peaceful. But this peace was deceptive. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense that something was wrong, as if the shadows themselves were watching. It was December 11, 2010, when a routine police search turned into the beginning of one of the most disturbing serial murder investigations in modern American history. A small search team was out looking for a young woman named Shannon Gilbert. She was 24 years old, an escort who had disappeared months earlier under frightening circumstances. On the night of her disappearance, she had placed a frantic 911 call. For over 20 minutes, she begged for help, repeating that someone was after her. Her terrified voice echoed into the dark, growing more panicked with each passing minute, before the call abruptly ended. When officers reached the neighborhood where the call had come from, she was gone. For months, her family pushed for answers, but nothing surfaced. Until this night. A police officer was walking his K9 partner along the roadside near the dunes, not far from where Shannon had vanished. The dog suddenly froze, nose to the ground, then jerked forward toward the tall grass. Moments later, they stumbled upon something wrapped in burlap. Even before the officer called for backup, the smell told him everything. It was a human body. When they carefully opened the sack, they found the remains of a young woman. Her body had been dumped like garbage, left to decompose in the freezing air. And almost immediately, investigators realized this wasn't Shannon Gilbert. They had uncovered something far bigger. The area was quickly sealed off, and a larger search began. Officers combed the dunes and roadside with flashlights, dogs, and helicopters. In the following days, 3 more bodies were discovered in similar burlap sacks. All of them were young women, all had worked as escorts advertised on Craigslist, and all had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. Their names would soon be known nationwide: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes. They were daughters, sisters, friends, ordinary people living difficult lives, who had vanished into the night with barely a trace. And now their bodies were surfacing together, within meters of each other, along a lonely stretch of road. The media storm hit like a tidal wave. News helicopters hovered over Gilgo Beach, while television reporters broadcast live from the scene. Forensic tents lined the road, and flashing lights cut through the thick fog as crime scene investigators worked. The phrase "Long Island serial killer" exploded into national headlines, and suddenly the quiet communities of Suffolk County were at the center of a nightmare. For many locals, it was unimaginable. People had driven down that same road for years, never realizing that bodies lay hidden just beyond the tall grass. Detectives called in help from the FBI and behavioral profilers, hoping to get ahead of what was clearly a serial predator. As search teams expanded their perimeter, they began uncovering even more human remains. Some were partial skeletons, some belonged to victims found elsewhere years earlier. Altogether, investigators eventually found remains linked to at least 10 different people along Ocean Parkway. The pattern was undeniable. Someone had been using this isolated stretch of land as a dumping ground for years, maybe even decades. The scope of the investigation was unlike anything Suffolk County Police had ever faced. Detectives worked grueling hours, trudging through marshland and dense brush, often in bitter winter conditions. The evidence was fragmentary, and the terrain swallowed clues easily. A single mistake could mean losing critical information forever. Pressure mounted from the media, the public, and victims' families. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. But the truth was, the killer had left very little behind, at least, little that was easy to find. Inside police headquarters, investigators created massive timelines and victim maps that covered entire walls. They analyzed phone records, Craigslist ads, travel histories, and missing persons reports from multiple states. Some of the victims had disappeared in New Jersey, some from New York City, and one from as far away as Maine. Yet they all ended up here, at Gilgo Beach. It suggested the killer had a wide hunting ground and the ability to move unnoticed. This wasn't someone impulsive. It was someone organized, calculating, and careful. That terrified the investigators most. He could be anyone: a neighbor, a delivery driver, a coworker. He could be watching the news at home like everyone else, quietly enjoying the chaos he had caused. In the neighborhood surrounding Gilgo Beach, paranoia began to take hold. People installed security cameras, kept their lights on at night, and started locking doors they'd once left open. Women working in escort services grew increasingly fearful. Some stopped taking new clients altogether, afraid they might be walking straight into a trap. And for the Gilbert family, every new discovery was a mixture of hope and horror. Hope that Shannon might still be alive. Horror that she might be found next. The first phase of the Gilgo Beach investigation was chaotic, intense, and emotionally draining. Each body uncovered pulled detectives deeper into a mystery that stretched far beyond what they initially imagined. They weren't just looking for a missing woman anymore. They were hunting a ghost, someone who had been killing for years, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement, hiding in plain sight. The investigation quickly grew into a massive operation, but beneath the surface, serious cracks were already forming. In those early months, coordination between different law enforcement agencies was disorganized and tense. Suffolk County Police had jurisdiction over the area, but the FBI wanted to bring in their behavioral analysis unit and advanced forensics. Instead of a seamless partnership, there was friction. Some senior officers were reluctant to involve outsiders, fearing that federal agents might overshadow their work or expose departmental failures. This hesitation would later prove costly. Meanwhile, detectives were drowning in leads. Hundreds of calls poured in from the public. Some claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles parked near the dunes at night. Others reported men who matched vague descriptions of potential suspects. There were tips from escort workers who believed they might have narrowly escaped dangerous clients. But with limited manpower and no centralized system for processing the information efficiently, valuable clues slipped through the cracks. Tips were misplaced, misfiled, or simply forgotten in the chaos. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was how long the killer had been able to operate undetected. For years, women had gone missing from nearby areas, New York City, New Jersey, and surrounding states. Many were sex workers, and unfortunately, their disappearances had not always been taken seriously. Some police departments treated these cases as voluntary runaways. Others failed to share information across jurisdictions. This fragmented approach created blind spots that the killer exploited perfectly. He chose victims society often overlooked and hunted in places where cooperation between agencies was weak. The terrain itself added another layer of difficulty. The marshlands around Gilgo Beach were dense, waterlogged, and treacherous. Clues could sink, decompose, or wash away in the tides. The killer clearly knew this area well. The way he wrapped the bodies in burlap and placed them just beyond easy view suggested someone methodical, perhaps local, who understood how to use the landscape to his advantage. The burlap sacks weren't random. They were the kind used in landscaping or construction. Detectives began to suspect they were dealing with someone who had practical knowledge of materials, disposal, and timing. Public fear escalated as the body count rose. Local news stations broadcast nightly updates, often focusing on the most gruesome details. National networks joined in, turning Gilgo Beach into a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the roads. Reporters speculated endlessly about who the killer could be: a truck driver, a cop, a fisherman, maybe even someone rich and powerful hiding in plain sight. Theories flourished on internet forums and talk shows. Some people claimed the killings were the work of multiple people, others believed a single predator had been operating for decades. As pressure mounted, the police made a controversial decision. They officially ruled that Shannon Gilbert's death was likely accidental. Her remains were eventually found in 2011, in a marshy area not far from where she had disappeared. Authorities concluded she had likely become disoriented and drowned while fleeing through the reeds that night. Her family never accepted this explanation. Neither did many members of the public. The timing of her disappearance, the 911 call, and the discovery of so many other bodies nearby made the accidental drowning theory feel like a convenient way to reduce the body count attributed to the killer. Critics accused the police of trying to avoid admitting they had a serial killer on their hands much earlier. The Gilbert family hired their own attorney, John Ray, who became one of the most vocal critics of law enforcement's handling of the case. He held press conferences, released transcripts of Shannon's 911 call, and repeatedly claimed that the police were either incompetent or deliberately hiding something. His accusations, whether fully justified or not, resonated with a public already suspicious of the authorities. Many residents of Suffolk County had long believed that the police department was plagued by corruption and internal politics. This case became a lightning rod for those frustrations. Behind closed doors, detectives were under immense stress. Leads were piling up faster than they could investigate them. They interviewed hundreds of people, from local residents to former clients of the victims. They examined surveillance footage, phone records, and Craigslist ads. They even went undercover in escort communities, posing as clients to gather intelligence. But despite their efforts, the killer remained elusive. He didn't leave fingerprints. DNA evidence was minimal or degraded. He seemed to strike with precision, then vanish without a trace. The psychological profile that began to emerge was chilling. FBI profilers described the killer as organized, intelligent, and likely living an unremarkable public life. He probably had a steady job, maybe a family, and blended into his surroundings. He enjoyed control and had a deep understanding of how law enforcement worked, or at least how to stay a few steps ahead of it. Some profilers believed he followed media coverage closely, adjusting his methods to avoid detection. The burlap sacks, the careful placement of bodies, and the choice of victims all pointed to someone who planned meticulously. As the months dragged on without an arrest, frustration turned into anger. Victims' families held vigils and rallies demanding answers. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs accusing the department of incompetence. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed the killer was a police officer, others thought he might be connected to organized crime or local politics. The lack of progress fed these narratives. Every day that passed without a suspect made it easier to believe that someone somewhere was covering something up. The killer, meanwhile, seemed to have vanished. There were no new confirmed victims after 2010, at least none found at Gilgo Beach. Some investigators believed he had stopped killing because of the intense publicity. Others feared he had simply changed hunting grounds, moving to a new area where he could operate in anonymity once again. Either possibility was terrifying. Detectives knew that serial killers rarely just stop. If he was still alive somewhere, he was watching and waiting. By the end of 2011, the investigation had ballooned into one of the largest serial murder probes in New York history, but the results were painfully thin. There was no suspect, no clear evidence trail, and no cohesive theory tying all the victims together. What they did have was fear, frustration, and a growing sense that they were chasing a phantom. As the investigation stretched into its second year, the task force began looking more closely at a growing list of potential suspects. Some of these names came from witness tips, others from painstaking analysis of victim histories and geographical profiling. Each suspect seemed plausible at first glance, but as detectives dug deeper, the trail would either go cold or unravel in frustrating ways. One of the earliest serious suspects was a local resident and businessman who lived just a few miles from Gilgo Beach. He fit several points on the emerging psychological profile: middle-aged, intelligent, with a stable job and no serious criminal history. He was known to frequent the same online spaces where some of the victims advertised their services. More disturbingly, several phone calls made to the victims' families after their disappearances had originated from a location near his workplace. Investigators obtained search warrants for his home and office, hoping to find a breakthrough. But despite days of combing through computers, vehicles, and personal belongings, they found nothing conclusive. No DNA, no incriminating evidence, just eerie coincidences. Another man, a former law enforcement officer from nearby Nassau County, became a person of interest after a series of bizarre tips. Several sex workers reported a man flashing a police badge and offering rides to keep them safe. One woman claimed she narrowly escaped when he became aggressive during an encounter. Detectives investigated his background thoroughly. He had been dismissed from the force years earlier for misconduct, but there was no clear link to the murders. Still, the idea that the killer could have once been a cop, or was pretending to be one, terrified both investigators and the public. It would explain the killer's ability to avoid detection and control situations with authority. There was also a local doctor whose name appeared in several escort workers' phone records. He had been a frequent client, and at least two of the victims were believed to have met him shortly before their disappearances. He lived not far from the dumping grounds and owned a property with a secluded backyard that could easily have been used to restrain victims. But when questioned, he was calm, cooperative, and had verifiable alibis for key dates. Without solid evidence, he remained just one name on a long and growing list. Perhaps one of the strangest leads came from a tip about a man who lived in a rundown house along Ocean Parkway. Neighbors described him as reclusive, eccentric, and prone to wandering the beach at odd hours. Some claimed to have seen him carrying large bags late at night. Detectives searched his property and found animal bones, strange tools, and piles of discarded burlap sacks. For a moment, they thought they had their man. But forensic testing revealed the bones were from animals, not humans, and his odd behavior, while unsettling, was not illegal. Once again, the promising lead fizzled out. The killer's phone activity offered both clues and frustration. In several cases, after the women went missing, their cell phones were used to make taunting calls to their families. In one particularly cruel instance, Melissa Barthelomy's younger sister received multiple calls from an unknown man who mocked her, described gruesome details about Melissa, and boasted that she would never be found. These calls were traced to crowded areas in Manhattan, like Times Square, where tracking a single person among thousands was nearly impossible. Whoever was making those calls knew how to exploit the environment. He kept the calls short, under 3 minutes, to avoid more precise triangulation. He was taunting the families and the police, confident that he couldn't be caught. Geographic profilers suggested the killer likely lived somewhere near the dumping grounds, possibly in Suffolk County. Serial killers often operate within what's called a comfort zone, an area they know well and where they feel confident committing crimes without detection. Gilgo Beach fit this perfectly, remote, dark at night, and close enough to residential areas to allow quick in and out trips. Detectives started looking closely at anyone who lived within a 10-mile radius and had a history of violence, sex crimes, or suspicious behavior. This generated hundreds of potential names, but background checks and surveillance narrowed it down to a few dozen. Some suspects stood out because of small, almost imperceptible patterns. One man, for example, regularly drove the parkway at odd hours for no clear reason. Another had deleted large portions of his online history right after media reports about the killings surfaced. A third was caught on a surveillance camera disposing of garbage bags late at night near a wooded area, though the contents turned out to be ordinary trash. Each time detectives thought they were closing in, the evidence slipped away like sand through their fingers. There were also whispers of more powerful figures. Some local residents speculated that the killer might be someone with wealth or political connections, someone untouchable. The isolated location of the body dumps, combined with the lack of progress, fueled conspiracy theories. Was the killer being protected? Were investigators deliberately steering away from certain suspects? These questions lingered, especially as months turned into years without a major break. Internally, the task force faced difficult choices about how much information to release to the public. Too much transparency could tip off the killer, allowing him to adjust his methods. Too little, and public trust would erode further. They walked a tightrope, carefully choosing which details to share through press conferences. Sometimes this backfired. When they downplayed certain pieces of evidence, the public accused them of hiding information. When they released details about the burlap sacks or phone calls, amateur sleuths flooded tip lines with wild theories, some helpful, many not. The combination of real suspects, false leads, and conspiracy theories created a maze that seemed impossible to navigate. Detectives often worked long nights staring at corkboards covered in photos, timelines, and maps, trying to find patterns that refused to emerge. The killer was either incredibly lucky, extremely careful, or both. He had managed to build an invisible wall around himself, one that law enforcement couldn't seem to penetrate. Years later, some investigators would admit privately that they believed they might have interviewed the killer at some point without realizing it. He could have been one of the many men who sat in interrogation rooms, calm and cooperative, offering just enough plausible answers to deflect suspicion. That thought haunted them. It meant the answer might have been right in front of their faces the entire time. The deeper the task force dug into the mystery, the clearer it became that they weren't dealing with a reckless predator who killed impulsively. They were dealing with someone calculated. Someone patient. The killer had operated for years without being caught, and that level of longevity pointed to a mind that understood both human behavior and the system meant to catch him. It was this dual understanding that made him so frightening. He was hunting people society often ignored and doing so in a way that left investigators chasing ghosts. FBI profilers spent months building a psychological portrait of the suspect. They concluded that the killer was likely a white male, between his 30s and 50s during the peak of the murders, with above-average intelligence. He probably maintained a stable outward appearance, a job, possibly a family, and no major criminal record. He was meticulous and methodical, taking steps to control every element of his crimes. He selected victims he believed were vulnerable and less likely to trigger intensive investigations if they disappeared. He planned the abductions and killings carefully, then disposed of the bodies in a location he knew would mask evidence. In many ways, he resembled other organized serial killers like BTK or the Green River Killer, men who blended into their communities while living double lives. What stood out in the profile was the killer's need for control. This wasn't someone who killed in a sudden rage. Each step of his process suggested a desire to dominate, not just his victims, but also the narrative surrounding the crimes. The taunting phone calls to families, the careful choice of dumping sites, the way he seemed to vanish just as police closed in. It all fit a pattern of someone who wanted to demonstrate superiority. He enjoyed not only the act of killing, but the power that came from manipulating everyone around him. This kind of behavior also indicated he was likely following the investigation closely. He probably read news articles, watched press conferences, and paid attention to public reaction. Every new development in the media could have been a data point for him to adjust his strategy. That's why some investigators believed he may have stopped killing not because he was caught off guard, but because he was adapting. After the discovery of the bodies, the area became too hot. Police were everywhere, the media was relentless, and people were on edge. For a man like this, control was everything. Killing during a media storm would have been sloppy, and he was anything but sloppy. Meanwhile, the fear that gripped Suffolk County began to take a psychological toll on ordinary residents. Gilgo Beach had always been a place of quiet isolation, a stretch of road where people walked dogs, jogged, or drove home late at night without a second thought. That changed almost overnight. People began looking over their shoulders. Home security systems were installed at record rates. Parents warned their daughters not to go out alone after dark. Some residents even avoided the parkway entirely, choosing longer routes just to stay away from the area associated with the killer. The sense of safety that had once defined the community was shattered. Local escort workers felt the impact even more intensely. Many stopped taking clients they didn't know personally. Some quit altogether, terrified that they could be next. Others banded together, sharing information about suspicious callers or meeting spots. For years, the killer had relied on the invisibility of his victims, people society too often ignored or dismissed. But now, that invisibility was fading. Escorts began speaking to the media, telling their stories, warning others, and demanding justice for their fallen friends. Their voices added a new dimension to the public conversation. These weren't faceless victims, they were human beings with families, fears, and dreams. Despite the fear, a strange kind of fascination also grew. The mystery of the Long Island serial killer became the subject of podcasts, blogs, and endless online speculation. Amateur detectives pored over maps, timelines, and police reports, convinced they could solve the case themselves. Some theories were surprisingly detailed and logical. For over a decade, the case of the Long Island serial killer had been a cold shadow hanging over Suffolk County. The bodies had been found, the task force had been formed, countless theories had emerged, and yet the killer himself remained invisible. Families grew older without answers. Investigators retired or were reassigned. Public interest came and went in waves. But beneath the surface, something had been slowly changing: technology. Advances in forensic science were rewriting what was possible in cold cases, and Gilgo Beach was about to become a prime example. In 2020, Suffolk County authorities quietly assembled a new investigative team. This wasn't the same task force of the past. This group was younger, more tech-savvy, and determined to approach the case with fresh eyes. They had access to cutting-edge DNA analysis, digital forensics, and massive databases that simply didn't exist during the original investigation. They began by meticulously reviewing every piece of evidence collected decades earlier, looking for anything that might yield results using modern methods. One of the pivotal breakthroughs came from something seemingly small: hair. During the original investigation, a single strand of hair had been found on the burlap used to wrap one of the victims. At the time, mitochondrial DNA testing was in its infancy and yielded inconclusive results. But by 2022, forensic genealogy had advanced dramatically. Investigators submitted the hair for advanced testing, hoping it might contain enough genetic material to build a profile. The results exceeded their expectations. The DNA matched partially to a family line in a genealogy database, and with painstaking work, analysts narrowed the pool down to a few individuals. Parallel to the DNA work, digital forensic experts began analyzing cell phone tower data near the locations where victims had last been seen. This wasn't new, but modern software allowed them to cross-reference hundreds of thousands of data points quickly. Patterns emerged. Certain cell phone IDs consistently appeared near the victims' last known locations and near the dumping sites. It was as if a ghost had left digital footprints decades after the crimes. Investigators followed these footprints, slowly but surely zeroing in on a specific geographical area where the suspect might have lived or worked. In early 2023, the investigation quietly honed in on a man living in Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood that seemed worlds away from the horror of Gilgo Beach. His name was Rex Hoyerman. By outward appearances, he was an ordinary middle-aged man. He was an architect, married, with 2 children. Neighbors described him as quiet, maybe a bit eccentric, but nothing that screamed serial killer. And yet, as investigators dug deeper, the connections multiplied. His phone records placed him in suspicious locations at key times. His physical appearance matched witness descriptions from years earlier. And most damning of all, DNA recovered from the hair matched mitochondrial DNA from his wife, indicating that hair from their household had been transferred to a victim's burlap. Investigators didn't move quickly. They couldn't afford to. The case had been mishandled too many times in the past, and any mistake now could be catastrophic. For months, they quietly surveilled Hoyerman. Undercover officers followed him. Digital experts monitored his internet activity. Forensic teams discreetly collected discarded items, bottles, straws, anything that might contain DNA. Eventually, they obtained a direct DNA sample that confirmed the match. The net was closing in. On July 13, 2023, after decades of mystery, the arrest finally came. Officers swarmed Hoyerman's home in a dramatic raid that was broadcast nationwide. The quiet architect from Massapequa Park was charged with multiple counts of murder in connection with the Gilgo Beach victims. The news hit like a thunderclap. After so many years of speculation, the idea that the killer might have been living an ordinary suburban life was almost too shocking to process. Journalists descended on the neighborhood. Helicopters buzzed overhead. The house itself became a symbol, an unassuming structure hiding unimaginable darkness. Neighbors were stunned. Some said they had shared casual conversations with him, borrowed tools, or seen him at local stores. Others admitted they had always found him unsettling but never imagined something like this. Interviews with people who had worked with him described a man who could be both professional and oddly cold. Some clients recalled moments that, in retrospect, felt chilling, comments or behaviors that seemed inconsequential at the time but now took on a sinister light. The more investigators revealed, the clearer it became that Hoyerman had led a double life, one that allowed him to function in society while allegedly committing horrific acts. The arrest reignited public interest in the case on a massive scale. News networks ran special coverage, retracing the timeline of the murders. Podcasts and YouTube channels exploded with theories, analysis, and speculation. Was this really the man responsible for all the killings? Or just some of them? The investigation was far from over. Prosecutors were careful in their language, charging Hoyerman with the murders of specific victims while continuing to investigate his potential involvement in others. It was possible, some believed, that there were multiple killers operating along Gilgo Beach, and that he was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Behind the scenes, detectives pored over decades of evidence with renewed urgency. Every scrap of information connected to Hoyerman was examined under a microscope. His past movements, his internet history, his financial records, everything was scrutinized. Investigators also worked closely with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to update the psychological profile in light of the new suspect. Many elements fit: the intelligence, the organized nature of the crimes, the ability to blend in. But other aspects raised questions. Could he have acted alone for so many years without leaving more definitive traces? Or had the task force missed connections between multiple offenders? For the families of the victims, the arrest was bittersweet. There was a sense of vindication. Finally, after decades of pain, there was a face, a name, a suspect. But there was also anger. Why had it taken so long? How many lives might have been spared if earlier investigations hadn't been hampered by bureaucracy, incompetence, and lack of technology? Vigils were held, candles lit, and names read aloud. Some relatives wept openly, others stood in quiet, stoic silence. Justice was closer than ever, but it wasn't complete. Not yet. The arrest also sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. It was a stark reminder that serial killers can hide in plain sight for decades, living ordinary lives while evading capture. It highlighted the transformative power of modern forensic techniques, particularly forensic genealogy, in solving cold cases once thought impossible. Departments everywhere began reviewing their own unsolved cases, wondering what clues might be hiding in old evidence boxes, waiting for technology to catch up. For Suffolk County, the case was far from over, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Hope that the families would finally get answers. Hope that justice would be served. And hope that the darkness that had haunted Gilgo Beach for so long might finally be dispelled. After Rex Hoyerman's arrest, the atmosphere in Suffolk County shifted dramatically. For the first time in over a decade, people felt that there might finally be justice for the victims found along Gilgo Beach. But as the excitement of the arrest settled, a complex, uncomfortable reality emerged. Catching a suspect was not the same as convicting him. The legal process was only beginning, and both prosecutors and defense lawyers were preparing for what would likely become one of the most closely watched trials in modern American criminal history. Prosecutors knew they were walking into a storm. The case spanned decades, involved multiple victims, and was built on a combination of circumstantial evidence, DNA, digital data, and witness statements from years earlier. Every piece of evidence would be scrutinized, every decision questioned. Defense attorneys were already signaling their strategy. They would attack the credibility of the investigation, highlight the gaps in the timeline, and question whether Hoyerman could really have acted alone. After all, there were still unanswered questions. Some victims didn't fit the same pattern as others. Some timelines overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. There were even whispers within law enforcement that perhaps more than one killer had been operating along Gilgo Beach. The prosecution's job was to present a clear, compelling narrative that tied Hoyerman to the murders beyond a reasonable doubt. To do this, they focused heavily on the DNA evidence, the cell tower data, and the pattern of behavior. They constructed a timeline that showed how his movements coincided with key moments in the victims' disappearances. They highlighted his alleged use of burner phones to contact victims, his familiarity with the area, and the chilling similarities between the murders he was charged with. In court, they would also lean on the psychological portrait, a man who led a double life, hiding in plain sight while preying on vulnerable women. Meanwhile, the defense team worked relentlessly to chip away at the state's case. They argued that the DNA evidence was not definitive. Mitochondrial DNA only shows maternal lineage, not individual identity. They claimed that hair found on the burlap could have been transferred innocently through secondary contact. They questioned the accuracy of cell phone tower data from more than a decade ago. And they raised doubts about the witness statements, pointing out how memories fade and change over time. Their strategy was clear: plant seeds of doubt in the jury's mind. If they could convince even one juror that the evidence was circumstantial or misinterpreted, they could avoid a conviction. As these legal maneuvers played out, the public watched with a mix of fascination and unease. Television networks aired endless commentary. Podcasts dissected every court filing. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Some people were convinced Hoyerman was the Long Island serial killer. Others believed he was only part of the story, or worse, a convenient scapegoat for a police department desperate to close a painful chapter. The truth was that, even after the arrest, not all the pieces fit neatly together. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the list of unanswered questions. There were victims found along Gilgo Beach whose deaths didn't match Hoyerman's alleged modus operandi. Some were older, others younger. Some were wrapped in burlap, others were not. A few had been killed years before Hoyerman was even considered a suspect. Were these all the work of one man who changed his methods over time, or were multiple killers using the same remote stretch of beach as a dumping ground? Investigators themselves were divided on this point. Some believed strongly in a single killer theory, citing behavioral evolution and experimentation. Others argued that the inconsistencies pointed to more than one predator operating in the same area. The possibility of multiple killers cast a long shadow over the entire case. It meant that, even if Hoyerman was convicted, the story might not end. There could still be another person, or several people, out there walking free. This notion terrified residents and frustrated investigators. It also meant that the families of certain victims might never get the closure they so desperately craved. Justice for one set of murders wouldn't necessarily bring answers for all. As the trial date approached, Suffolk County found itself reliving the fear and tension of earlier years. Court hearings were packed with journalists, family members, and curious onlookers. Security was tight, with police carefully managing the throngs of people who gathered outside the courthouse each day. Inside, prosecutors and defense attorneys sparred over evidence admissibility, expert witnesses, and jury selection. The case had become more than a legal battle. It was a cultural event, a reckoning with years of fear, failure, and mystery. For the families of the victims, the emotional toll was immense. Some had waited decades for this moment. They sat quietly in court, clutching photographs of loved ones, listening to the gruesome details being recited like cold facts. Others couldn't bear to attend, unwilling to reopen old wounds. Support groups formed, bringing together people who shared the unique pain of losing someone to a serial killer. They leaned on each other through vigils, community events, and late-night conversations. No matter the outcome of the trial, their lives had been irreversibly altered. Beyond the courthouse, the case sparked a broader conversation about law enforcement failures, societal indifference, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities. Many of the victims were sex workers, people who, historically, have been treated as less important by both society and the justice system. Activists used the spotlight to demand changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly for people in high-risk professions. They argued that if these women had been taken more seriously from the beginning, lives might have been saved. The case forced uncomfortable questions about whose lives are prioritized and whose are ignored. The psychological impact on the community lingered as well. Even with a suspect in custody, many residents admitted they still felt uneasy walking near Gilgo Beach. Some avoided it entirely, unable to shake the association with the horrors that had been uncovered there. The name Gilgo Beach had become synonymous with mystery and death, a reminder that evil can lurk behind ordinary facades and in familiar places. As the trial drew closer, one thing became clear: this case had changed Suffolk County forever. It had exposed flaws in the justice system, shattered a community's sense of safety, and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Whether or not Rex Heuermann was ultimately found guilty of all the murders attributed to the Long Island serial killer, the legacy of the case would endure. It was a story of darkness hiding in plain sight, of victims overlooked, of a killer who evaded capture for far too long, and of a community forever marked by what happened on a quiet stretch of beach. The courtroom battles would decide one man's fate, but the larger mysteries, how many victims there truly were, how many killers, and why it took so long to bring the truth to light, would continue to haunt investigators and the public for years to come. Some mysteries, especially those born in the shadows, do not give up their secrets easily. And Gilgo Beach still had shadows left. Even after Rex Heuermann's arrest and the avalanche of media coverage that followed, the Long Island serial killer case refused to fade quietly into history. Instead, it evolved. Theories multiplied. New voices joined the conversation. And the shadows of Gilgo Beach seemed to stretch further than anyone had anticipated. What began as a local tragedy had become a story that gripped the entire nation, a haunting reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, and how some mysteries resist closure no matter how many years pass. One of the most persistent questions haunting investigators was whether Rex Heuermann was truly responsible for all the murders attributed to the Long Island serial killer, or whether multiple predators had operated along Gilgo Beach. The timeline of killings stretched from the mid-1990s to 2010, a span of nearly 15 years. That kind of longevity was rare even for the most prolific serial offenders. It raised uncomfortable possibilities. Perhaps there had been more than one killer, or perhaps Heuermann had evolved his methods so dramatically over time that earlier murders looked like they were committed by someone else. Former detectives and criminal profilers were divided. Some believed that the evidence against Heuermann was strong for the victims he had been charged with, but they remained skeptical about the others. Several victims were discovered in ways that didn't match his alleged modus operandi. Some bodies were dismembered, others left intact. Some were found wrapped in burlap, while others were not. These discrepancies kept alive the possibility that Gilgo Beach had become, intentionally or not, a kind of dumping ground for multiple killers who knew its isolated stretches would shield their crimes. Another theory that gained traction online was that Heuermann might have had an accomplice, or even been part of a loose network of predators. It sounded sensational, but several details fed this narrative. Some witness statements described multiple suspicious vehicles in the area at different times. Others claimed to have seen more than one man with some of the victims shortly before their disappearances. While these reports were often inconsistent and decades old, they were enough to keep speculation alive. Amateur sleuths pored over maps and timelines, drawing connections that investigators had long abandoned. Some theories were far-fetched, others chillingly plausible. As public interest reignited, law enforcement agencies across New York received a flood of new tips. Some came from people who had lived in the area during the years of the murders and had remembered strange encounters. Others came from individuals who believed they had seen or even known the killer without realizing it at the time. A few tips pointed to completely different suspects, men who had since died, moved away, or disappeared themselves. Each tip had to be carefully evaluated, adding to the already massive workload facing investigators preparing for trial. Meanwhile, journalists continued to dig. Investigative reporters unearthed old documents, interviewed retired officers, and tracked down family members of lesser-known victims. Some of what they found raised uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. There were reports of early leads that had been ignored, suspects who had slipped through the cracks, and jurisdictional disputes between local police and the FBI that had delayed progress. These revelations fueled public frustration and deepened the sense that justice had been obstructed not only by the killer's cunning but also by institutional failures. The cultural fascination with the case reached almost obsessive levels. True crime podcasts released multi-part series dissecting every detail. Streaming services announced documentaries promising new revelations. YouTube channels uploaded hour-long deep dives analyzing suspects, evidence, and the psychology of serial killers. Some treated the case with seriousness and respect, others sensationalized it, blurring the line between investigation and entertainment. But one thing was clear: the Long Island serial killer case had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders, it was the idea that someone could live among us for so long unseen, unchecked. Criminologists suggested that part of the fascination stemmed from the setting itself. Gilgo Beach was not an anonymous urban alleyway or a remote forest. It was a suburban, almost idyllic area, quiet, wealthy in parts, familiar. The idea that such a place could harbor such horror challenged people's assumptions about safety. It forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that danger doesn't always come from the shadows of unfamiliar places. Sometimes, it lives right next door. That realization was both terrifying and compelling, feeding endless discussions about how communities perceive and respond to crime. Another lingering thread involved the victims whose identities remained unknown. Despite advances in forensic technology, several sets of remains found along Gilgo Beach had not been conclusively identified. These unidentified victims became symbols of the broader failures in the case. Who were they? Where had they come from? Did they have families still waiting for answers, unaware of what had happened? Efforts to identify them using genetic genealogy were ongoing, but progress was slow. Each breakthrough brought hope, but also fresh grief as families were confronted with the realities of what had happened. Behind the scenes, investigators were quietly exploring whether new technologies, like advanced DNA phenotyping or AI-driven geographic profiling, could shed light on lingering mysteries. These methods had already helped crack cold cases elsewhere, and some believed they might eventually answer questions that had haunted Gilgo Beach for decades. But these were long-term efforts, often hindered by funding limitations and legal hurdles. For now, many of the most tantalizing mysteries remained just out of reach. For the families, this endless speculation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the attention kept the case alive, ensuring their loved ones weren't forgotten. On the other, the constant flow of theories, documentaries, and amateur investigations often reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Some families participated actively, hoping that renewed interest might bring new information. Others withdrew from the public eye, exhausted by years of reliving their trauma through headlines and online debates. As time went on, the Gilgo Beach murders became less about one man and more about the larger questions they raised, about law enforcement, technology, community, and the darkness that can fester in ordinary places. Whether Rex Heuermann was ultimately convicted or not, the case had already carved out its place in American criminal history. It was a story that defied easy conclusions, a puzzle with pieces scattered across decades, jurisdictions, and lives. The beach itself remained eerily quiet. On windy nights, the sound of the ocean mingled with the distant hum of traffic along Ocean Parkway. For some, Gilgo Beach would always be a crime scene, a place where the illusion of safety was shattered forever. For others, it was a reminder, a warning that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it wears the face of the man next door. Years passed after Rex Heuermann's arrest, but the shadow of the Long Island serial killer case lingered stubbornly, refusing to dissipate. Court hearings dragged on. Evidence was dissected, analyzed, and challenged. Documentaries kept the story alive in the public imagination. And for the families of the victims, time didn't bring closure, it simply made the silence louder. Gilgo Beach had become more than just a stretch of sand along Ocean Parkway, it was a symbol. A graveyard without headstones. A mystery that, even in the age of DNA and digital footprints, refused to fully surrender its secrets. Some families clung to the hope that the trial would finally bring them peace. They attended every hearing, watched every press conference, and followed each development with anxious eyes. Others had grown weary of the process, disillusioned by years of delays and what they perceived as bureaucratic incompetence. For them, justice had taken too long. The world had moved on, their grief had not. Some spoke to reporters, determined to keep their loved ones' memories alive. Others retreated into privacy, choosing to grieve away from the relentless public gaze. Investigators, too, bore the weight of the case long after the spotlight dimmed. For many, it was the defining investigation of their careers. Some had retired, unable to shake the frustration of unsolved threads and unanswered questions. Others stayed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to let the case remain incomplete. Cold case detectives continued to sift through evidence, re-examining details with new technologies, hoping that one overlooked clue might finally bring total clarity. But each lead seemed to branch into more questions than answers, as if the case itself were designed to resist resolution. The legal battle surrounding Rex Heuermann unfolded slowly, with both prosecution and defense leveraging every tool available. His lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging evidence, questioning procedures, and seeking to suppress key forensic findings. Prosecutors countered with new expert testimonies and additional digital evidence. It was a war of attrition, fought in sterile courtrooms under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Every development was broadcast, analyzed, and debated, turning the trial into a macabre spectacle that captivated millions. Yet even as the trial progressed, whispers persisted. There were detectives, retired and active, who quietly admitted their doubts. Not about Heuermann's guilt in some of the murders, but about whether he was the whole story. The timeline was too long. The methods too inconsistent. The number of victims potentially too high for one man to account for alone. Some believed that the killer or killers might have operated in overlapping periods, unknowingly using the same isolated beach as a dumping ground. Others suspected that Heuermann might have escalated over time, changing his approach as technology and police tactics evolved. Either way, the uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. Meanwhile, Gilgo Beach itself changed. What was once a quiet, overlooked stretch of coastline became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. True crime enthusiasts visited the area, some respectfully, others morbidly curious. They photographed the dunes, walked the road where bodies had been found, and imagined the nights when the killer prowled in darkness. Locals had mixed feelings about this attention. Some welcomed it, hoping that keeping the case in the public eye would lead to new tips. Others saw it as invasive, a transformation of their home into a spectacle. Law enforcement eventually installed additional surveillance cameras and increased patrols around the beach and parkway. Community watch programs grew stronger. But the fear never entirely left. Even years later, residents spoke of how they still locked their doors a little earlier at night, avoided walking alone on deserted stretches, and watched strangers more carefully than before. The crimes had changed the psychological landscape of the community forever. The cultural impact also persisted. University criminology courses dissected the case as a modern example of investigative failures, forensic breakthroughs, and societal blind spots. Documentaries continued to air on streaming platforms, each promising new revelations, though most offered little beyond repackaged information. Podcasts revisited the story regularly, interviewing experts, family members, and amateur sleuths who were convinced they held pieces of the puzzle. The case had become part of American criminal folklore, a grim cautionary tale about how monsters can thrive in the spaces society neglects. Among the most haunting elements were the unidentified victims. Despite significant advances in forensic genealogy, several sets of remains still had no names. Efforts to identify them continued, but progress was slow and expensive. Each new identification brought a mix of relief and sorrow, relief that another person's story had been uncovered, sorrow at the brutal reality of their fate. For every name restored, several remained lost, their stories trapped in the sand and wind of Gilgo Beach. The families who had received answers often found that closure was more elusive than they had imagined. Knowing what had happened didn't erase years of not knowing. It didn't soften the trauma of the crimes or the pain of the loss. Some found solace in community, bonding with other families, attending memorials, supporting advocacy for vulnerable communities. Others struggled privately, haunted by the details of their loved ones' final moments. The pain was not something that could be neatly wrapped up with a verdict. It lingered, deep and permanent. As the years wore on, the trial reached its critical phases. Witnesses were called. Experts testified. Jurors listened intently, their expressions tight with concentration. The prosecution laid out its case meticulously, weaving together strands of DNA, cell phone data, and behavioral analysis. The defense countered with challenges to the credibility of witnesses, the chain of evidence, and the interpretation of forensic data. It was a battle between science and doubt, between years of investigative persistence and the defense's relentless effort to create uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, the media circus showed no signs of slowing. Crowds gathered daily, some holding signs demanding justice, others simply curious. True crime fans treated the trial like a live event, discussing each twist and turn online as if it were a serialized drama. But for those at the center, the families, the investigators, the lawyers, it was anything but entertainment. It was the culmination of years of pain, work, and relentless pursuit of truth. Through it all, one unsettling truth remained: even if the jury returned a guilty verdict, not every question would be answered. There would still be unidentified victims. Still theories about accomplices. Still gaps in the timeline. The Long Island serial killer case had become bigger than one man, one trial, or even one generation. It was a story that refused to fully close, its edges frayed by time, tragedy, and human fallibility. The courtroom was packed on the day the verdict was expected. Rows of family members, journalists, and spectators filled the benches. Television cameras waited outside, broadcasting every development to a nation that had followed the case for years. For the families of the victims, this moment was the culmination of a long and agonizing journey. Some clutched photographs of their loved ones, others held each other's hands, silently bracing for what was to come. It wasn't just about justice for a man on trial, it was about the decades of fear, pain, and uncertainty that had haunted them since the bodies were first discovered along Gilgo Beach. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The jurors filed in, their expressions guarded, revealing nothing. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Prosecutors sat with tense determination, while the defense team maintained a facade of confidence. Rex Hoyerman sat at the defense table, as he had throughout the trial, stone-faced, inscrutable, a man whose ordinary appearance seemed at odds with the monstrous accusations laid against him. When the foreperson of the jury stood, the room fell silent. Time seemed to slow. The charges were read one by one, each accompanied by the jury's decision. For several counts of murder, the verdict was guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some family members gasped, others wept quietly. Years of anguish and unanswered questions had finally found a partial resolution in those two words. For other charges, the verdict was more complex. Some counts resulted in not guilty decisions, reflecting the gaps and uncertainties in the evidence. The outcome was not a clean, sweeping victory for the prosecution, but it was enough to secure a lengthy prison sentence. Hoyerman would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Outside, the reaction was immediate and intense. Crowds erupted into a mixture of cheers, tears, and raw emotion. News outlets went live with breaking coverage. Commentators analyzed every aspect of the verdict, from the strength of the evidence to the implications for other cold cases. Some hailed the decision as long overdue justice, others noted the lingering uncertainties and cautioned that the story wasn't truly over. For the families, the verdict brought a strange, bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, at least partially, but closure remained elusive. Some victims were not included in the trial. Some bodies were still unidentified. Some questions would likely never be answered. The guilty verdict did not erase decades of pain, it merely provided a formal acknowledgement of it. Many family members described their feelings not as triumph, but as quiet exhaustion. The battle was over, but the scars remained. In the months following the verdict, the case continued to reverberate through American culture. Documentaries and podcasts dissected the trial, examining how such a long-running investigation had finally culminated in a conviction. Law enforcement agencies studied the case as an example of both investigative perseverance and systemic failure. University criminology courses added new chapters to their syllabi, analyzing how forensic genealogy, cell phone data, and psychological profiling had finally converged to solve one of the most haunting serial murder cases in modern history. Yet even with Hoyerman in prison, the shadows along Gilgo Beach remained. Unidentified victims still waited for names. Alternative suspect theories persisted online. Some amateur sleuths continued to believe that at least one other killer had operated during the same period, taking advantage of the area's isolation. Others speculated that Hoyerman might confess to more crimes in the future, or that new evidence would emerge linking him to additional murders. The story refused to end neatly, and perhaps it never would. Investigators faced the difficult task of deciding which aspects of the case to pursue further. Some believed that resources should focus on identifying the remaining victims and bringing closure to their families. Others argued that cold case units should continue probing alternative suspect theories, just in case the full truth had yet to surface. Meanwhile, the community of Suffolk County continued to live with the uneasy knowledge that their quiet beaches had been the hunting grounds of a killer, or killers, for years. For the wider public, the Long Island serial killer case became more than just a story of crime and justice. It became a symbol of the ways evil can fester in ordinary places, hiding behind the most mundane facades. It was a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of marginalized communities, the failures of law enforcement, and the persistence of mystery even in an age of unprecedented technological capability. People continued to talk about the case, to visit Gilgo Beach, to theorize about what had really happened during those dark years. Rex Hoyerman himself remained an enigma. In prison, he gave no confessions, no dramatic interviews. He maintained his innocence on several charges, even as he began serving multiple life sentences. Some believed he enjoyed the attention, that the silence was his final act of control, keeping investigators, families, and the public guessing. Others thought he was simply a coward, unwilling to confront the full scope of his alleged actions. Whatever the truth, his name was now permanently etched into the dark annals of American criminal history. For the families, the years after the trial were a time of reckoning. Some found ways to heal, slowly rebuilding their lives. They created scholarships in the names of their loved ones, participated in advocacy for missing persons, or spoke publicly about the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals. Others struggled to move on, their lives permanently divided into before and after. The pain didn't disappear with a verdict, it simply changed shape, becoming a quiet presence that accompanied them each day.
The community, too, bore the scars.
Gilgo Beach was no longer just a scenic coastal stretch, it was a place forever marked by the horrors that had unfolded there. Some residents avoided it entirely. Others visited regularly, laying flowers or pausing in silence at the places where bodies had been found. The beach had become a place of remembrance, but also a reminder that evil had walked among them, unnoticed, for far too long. In the end, the Long Island serial killer case stood as a complex, unsettling story, one that defied easy conclusions. It was about one man, yes, but it was also about many lives: the victims, their families, the investigators, and the community. It was a story of failure and perseverance, horror and resilience, darkness and the search for light. Even after the trial, after the verdict, after the media frenzy faded, the legacy of those murders lingered like a cold wind coming off the Atlantic. Long after the courtroom doors closed, after the cameras packed up, and the journalists filed their last reports, Gilgo Beach remained. The wind still swept over the dunes, carrying the salty smell of the Atlantic. Waves still crashed against the shoreline. To the casual observer, it was just another quiet stretch of Long Island's coast. But to those who knew the story, every gust of wind and every shadow along the sand carried whispers of the past. This place was no longer just a beach. It was a monument to secrets buried too long, and to the lives stolen in the darkness. At night, the road along Ocean Parkway is almost eerily silent. Streetlights cast thin, flickering halos that barely touch the edges of the trees. Cars pass occasionally, their headlights cutting brief, sharp paths through the fog that sometimes settles in from the ocean. It's easy to imagine how someone could disappear here. How the killer, all those years ago, used this lonely stretch of land as his hunting ground. The isolation that once made the area peaceful had become the perfect camouflage for horror. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not erase what happened. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, all came and went with empty chairs and quiet moments of grief. Some created foundations to help other families of missing persons. Others visited the beach alone, standing in the cold wind, staring out at the dark water, and wondering about the final moments of their loved ones' lives. They had answers now, yes, but answers don't bring people back. Answers don't heal every wound. The scars of Gilgo Beach ran deep. The case had become a cultural touchstone, studied in universities, analyzed in documentaries, debated on podcasts, and dissected by amateur sleuths online. But beneath the noise and speculation was a quieter, more unsettling truth: not everything had been solved. Some bodies remained unidentified. Some timelines didn't quite fit. Some questions refused to die. The arrest and conviction of Rex Hoyerman had provided partial justice, but the story itself was still incomplete. The shadows of Gilgo Beach were not so easily banished. In the years that followed, new generations would grow up hearing about the case in hushed tones, like a dark legend passed down through the community. They would drive along Ocean Parkway at night and glance at the dunes, imagining the horrors that had unfolded there. Some would study criminology because of it. Others would avoid the area entirely, unwilling to confront the chill that lingered in the air. The Long Island serial killer had become more than a man, he had become a symbol, a reminder of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, in the most ordinary places. Law enforcement agencies across the country looked to the case as both a warning and a lesson. It showed how technology could eventually catch a killer who once seemed untouchable, but it also revealed the devastating consequences of investigative delays and societal indifference. The victims were vulnerable women, many working in the sex trade, people too often ignored, stigmatized, or dismissed. Their disappearances didn't trigger the urgency they deserved. And in that gap, in that silence, a killer thrived. The legacy of the case was not just in the courtroom verdicts, or in the documentaries that would be made for years to come. It was in the changes that slowly began to take root. Police departments implemented new protocols for handling missing persons cases. Genetic genealogy became a standard tool in cold case investigations. Communities became more vigilant. And families of the victims found ways to ensure that their loved ones' names would not fade into history. Vigils were held annually at Gilgo Beach. Candles were lit, names were read aloud, and the wind carried the sound of quiet prayers out over the dark water. But even with these changes, the mystery lingered. Some investigators still believed that other killers might have operated during that time, their crimes hidden beneath the weight of Hoyerman's case. Others thought that perhaps all the answers were already buried somewhere in the evidence, waiting for someone with fresh eyes and new tools to uncover them. And there were those who accepted that not every mystery is meant to be fully solved, that some stories end not with a clean conclusion, but with echoes that fade slowly, never entirely disappearing. On certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the ocean breeze carries a biting chill, Gilgo Beach feels suspended between the past and the present. You can stand on the roadside, listen to the distant crash of waves, and imagine the footsteps that once marked this sand. Somewhere out there, in the dark, lives were ended, and a community was forever changed. The killer thought he could hide his crimes beneath the quiet rhythm of the sea.
For a long time, he was right.
But the truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but inevitably. And even when not every question is answered, the story remains, carved into the landscape like an invisible monument. Gilgo Beach stands today as both a crime scene and a reminder. A reminder that evil can hide where you least expect it. That justice, while slow, can catch up even after decades. And that some shadows never fully disappear. They linger, just out of sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see them. More than a decade has passed since the first bodies were found along Gilgo Beach, and yet the story of the Long Island serial killer continues to evolve in unexpected ways. What was once considered a closed chapter is now being reopened by modern technology, renewed investigative efforts, and a public that refuses to forget. As of 2024 and 2025, the case remains a living, breathing mystery, one that still has the power to surprise investigators and captivate the nation. In recent years, advances in forensic science have changed the way law enforcement approaches cold cases. The rise of forensic genealogy, the same technology that helped identify the Golden State Killer, has become an indispensable tool. Old evidence from the Gilgo Beach murders is being re-examined with techniques that were unimaginable during the original investigation. Hair samples, degraded DNA, and trace evidence stored for decades are now yielding results that could provide new leads. In some cases, laboratories are able to reconstruct partial genetic profiles from minuscule fragments, creating family trees that investigators can methodically narrow down. One major focus in 2024 has been the identification of the remaining unidentified victims. These individuals, whose remains were found along the beach but never named, have become symbols of the case's unresolved aspects. Working with genealogists and advanced phenotyping labs, investigators are slowly piecing together their identities. Several breakthroughs have already occurred. One previously unidentified victim was matched to a distant relative through a commercial DNA database, leading to a positive identification after more than 20 years. For the family, the news brought both heartbreak and relief. They finally knew what had happened, but the decades of uncertainty had taken their toll. In addition to genetic technology, digital forensics has become an increasingly powerful investigative tool. Detectives are revisiting old cell phone tower data with modern algorithms, uncovering patterns that were invisible with earlier analytical methods. They're also examining online communications, escort service records, and even early social media platforms to trace interactions between victims and potential suspects. The digital footprints left behind, once considered too vast and messy to interpret, are now being organized and cross-referenced by AI systems capable of finding connections that human analysts might miss. The renewed investigation has also sparked collaboration between agencies that once operated in silos. The FBI, local police, state investigators, and forensic experts are now working together in ways that were unprecedented during the initial years of the case. Information sharing platforms allow real-time updates across jurisdictions. Cold case detectives from other parts of the country have even reached out, suspecting potential links between Gilgo Beach and unsolved cases in other states. While no definitive connections have been confirmed, the possibility that the Long Island serial killer, or multiple killers, operated beyond New York remains open. Public interest, far from fading, has actually intensified. True crime media has entered a new era of immersive storytelling, with podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels reaching massive audiences worldwide. The Gilgo Beach murders are frequently revisited, not just as a mystery, but as a cautionary tale about investigative failures, societal indifference, and the dangers of underestimating marginalized communities. Entire online communities have formed, some with thousands of members, dedicated to analyzing every shred of available evidence. While not all amateur investigations are helpful, some have provided valuable tips that law enforcement has quietly pursued. The cultural legacy of the case has also deepened. Gilgo Beach has become both a memorial site and a symbol. Each year, on the anniversary of the discovery of the first bodies, vigils are held. Families of victims gather with community members, journalists, and even retired detectives. They light candles, read names, and speak about the importance of justice and remembrance. What was once an isolated crime scene has become a place where people confront the reality of violence, resilience, and unfinished stories. For investigators still working the case, 2025 represents both opportunity and pressure. New leads are emerging thanks to technology, but expectations are higher than ever. Every development is scrutinized by a public that has been following this story for over a decade. There's hope that more unidentified victims will be named soon, and perhaps even new suspects brought to light. But there's also caution. Many of the remaining mysteries are complex, with evidence degraded by time and the environment. Solving them will require patience, precision, and sometimes luck. There is also a growing awareness that the Long Island serial killer case is not just about catching a perpetrator, it's about understanding systemic failures. Why did these murders go undetected for so long? Why were early warnings ignored? How did societal biases allow vulnerable women to vanish without triggering immediate action? These are questions being discussed in law enforcement training programs, policy forums, and academic circles. The case has become a catalyst for change, inspiring reforms in how missing persons cases are prioritized and investigated. And yet, despite the technological breakthroughs, the collaborative efforts, and the cultural reckoning, the Gilgo Beach murders retain their eerie, unresolved quality. Some mysteries may never be fully untangled. Some answers may be lost to time. But the pursuit of truth continues, not as a desperate chase in the dark, but as a methodical, determined effort that refuses to give up. For the families, every development, no matter how small, matters. Each identification is another soul brought out of anonymity. Each potential lead is a glimmer of hope that more pieces of the puzzle will fall into place. For investigators, the case is both a burden and a mission. A reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that persistence combined with innovation can illuminate even the darkest corners of history. As 2025 unfolds, Gilgo Beach remains quiet, its sands holding stories that the ocean has not washed away. But in laboratories, offices, and digital archives across the country, people are still listening. Still searching. Still working to ensure that the final secrets of the Long Island serial killer are brought to light. Night falls quickly along Gilgo Beach. When the sun sinks beneath the horizon, the landscape transforms. The breeze sharpens, the ocean darkens, and the distant sound of waves becomes a low, relentless whisper. Streetlights along Ocean Parkway cast pale circles of light, but they do little to push back the darkness. Out here, away from the noise of the city, silence takes on a weight of its own. It presses against you, reminding you how easy it is to disappear into it. This is where it happened. This is where lives ended, quietly, brutally, without warning. Even now, years later, the beach holds its secrets close. Investigators have combed through every patch of sand, every inch of roadside, every scrap of evidence. Families have searched for answers, journalists have dug through records, and armchair detectives have traced timelines late into the night. But the beach itself remains unchanged. The dunes don't speak. The trees don't tell stories. The wind carries no confessions. Somewhere out there, in that vast silence, are the echoes of footsteps that led victims to their deaths. Footsteps no one heard. Footsteps no one stopped. For decades, this place was a hunting ground. A predator moved through the fog, selecting victims from the margins of society, knowing they would not be missed quickly. He drove these roads under cover of darkness, his headlights cutting through the night, his mind cold and methodical. He wrapped bodies in burlap and left them where the tide and the trees would hide them. He watched as the world went about its business, oblivious. He blended in. He waited. He killed again. The thought that such evil could thrive in plain sight is what chills people the most. He wasn't a monster hiding in the woods or a shadowy figure from a nightmare. He was a man who lived among them, shopping at the same stores, driving the same streets, passing by neighbors who never suspected a thing. He waved to people. He paid his bills. And at night, he turned into something else entirely. That duality, the mask of normalcy covering unimaginable darkness, is what made him so dangerous. And perhaps, what allowed him to stay hidden for so long. The investigation uncovered horrifying truths, but not all of them. Some questions remain locked away, like secrets buried beneath the sand. Some victims are still unnamed, their identities lost to time and neglect. Some murders don't fit cleanly into any suspect's timeline. There are whispers of accomplices, of other predators who might have used the same isolated stretch of beach. The truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere between what's been proven and what still lingers in the shadows. Gilgo Beach at night is different from anywhere else. If you stand alone on the roadside and let the darkness settle around you, you can almost feel the weight of the past pressing down. The wind cuts through the stillness, and for a moment, the silence seems to listen back. You think about the people who drove here, unaware they were heading toward their final moments. You think about the killer, parking his car, moving through the night like a phantom. You imagine the fear, the violence, the silence afterward. And you realize that this place remembers, even if it doesn't speak. The families of the victims still carry the weight of those nights. Some visit the beach to leave flowers, others stay away entirely. But the grief doesn't fade, it just settles into the quiet spaces of their lives. Investigators who work the case talk about it in low voices, years after retirement, as if afraid to disturb something that still lingers. Locals drive past a little faster after dark. Joggers avoid certain paths. And the ocean keeps whispering against the shore, indifferent, eternal. There's something uniquely unsettling about a mystery that doesn't end. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, they brought answers, but not all of them. Some parts of this story will remain unknown, no matter how advanced technology becomes or how determined investigators are. That uncertainty is what keeps people awake at night. The idea that evil can walk beside us, unnoticed, for years. The idea that some questions will never be answered. The idea that the killer may not have been the only one. In the darkness of Gilgo Beach, history doesn't feel distant.
It feels close.
You can stand where victims were found and imagine headlights in the fog, the sound of tires on wet pavement, the sharp smell of the ocean. You can feel the isolation that shielded a killer for so long. It's almost too easy to picture it. And that's what makes this place so haunting, not just what happened here, but how easily it could happen again.
Gilgo Beach remains.
The ocean continues its endless rhythm. People pass by, some knowing, some unaware. The shadows stretch long at night, covering the dunes like a shroud. And somewhere beneath that silence, the past still waits.
Watching. Whispering.
Not every story ends with the truth.
Some end with silence. Some end with shadows.
And some never really end at all.